Have you ever had to support someone through something, a life event that just absolutely broke them? It can be a really hard thing to talk about, but I bet the person you were there for is super grateful for the job you did. If you do have a story, please give us a call. 1300 222 612. Tell me your story. Because sometimes that role is the hardest role to play, that support person, what to say, what to do, who to tell. I'm glad we've got you in here, Dr. Rachel Hannam, Clinical Director of North Brisbane Psychology. Thank you so much for coming in to help us find our way through this particular, I guess, road of this path that we all have to go on.
At some point, yeah.
Now, in what you do, you deal with people who are going through these crises, but you also deal with the people who are supporting those going through those crises.
Yeah, quite often.
What would be the biggest demographic of support people that you have to actually deal with?
Yeah. Well, when I think about the clients I've seen over the last 12 years or so, probably the most common presentation of a client who's struggling with their love for another person who's struggling would be, people in their, say, 35 to 60, because in that sort of middle age section of life, we've often got ageing parents, teenage children who might be struggling, or young adult children. Perhaps we're going through a separation, or a friend who we love very much is going through a separation. They call midlife the great squeeze. There can be career pressures, financial pressures, both on, ourselves and people we love.
It's funny. We actually spoke to one of our ageing experts on Monday about midlife crises and
Yep.
Whether it actually is a crisis these days, or is it just a change you have to make as well. But, you spoke about people of a particular age demographic supporting, I guess, maybe their younger kids or their young adult kids.
Yep.
So how does that manifest itself, and what sort of a toll do you see it taking on these people?
Yeah. Well, I think what's changed in the last 20 years, because the demand in our practice, we have 40 practitioners in our practice, and the demand for teenagers and young adult clients, we've seen that really increase in the last 10 years. And I attribute that to a few things. COVID's in the mix, social media and technology's in the mix, but also greater awareness of mental health issues would be one of the reasons for that greater presentation. So parents are actually taking their kids and teenagers, and even young adult kids who may be still living at home, to see a psychologist or a counsellor. And although parents have a lot more awareness that their child might be struggling with anxiety, depression, an eating disorder, something else, they don't necessarily know what to do, but good on them for seeking help. But then they often need to seek help themselves to learn how to talk to their child, support their loved one, and maybe keep their marriage intact while they deal with the stressors of this situation.
So you said a lot more people are coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So the numbers that we're recording are higher.
Yes, there's
But is
Yes.
that a reflection of, as you said, it's being recognised and people are actually taking action rather than it's going unnoticed and untreated?
Look, I think that addiction has always existed.
Yeah.
ADHD and autism have always existed, and anxiety and depression have always existed. Certainly some mental health challenges are on the increase. Others were just underground and not talked about, and we didn't have the language and the support services. So I think it's both.
Right. This is Dr. Rachel Hannam. She's Clinical Director of North Brisbane Psychology. My name's Johnny. You're on ABC Radio, Brisbane and Gold Coast. And we're talking about support people who potentially have to support loved ones through catastrophic life events that change you to the core.
Yes.
Okay. Let's get into brass tacks. This is actually quite difficult for me to talk about, to be honest, because I think it's something that affects everyone.
Yes,
and
me
look,
too.
If you're listening and you have a story to tell about supporting someone who has been through an event, the number to call is 1300 222 612, and you can talk to myself and Dr. Rachel and potentially get some tips, because that's what my next question is going to be about.
Yeah.
How do I know if I'm doing too much, enough, just the right amount? How do I become Goldilocks and get
it just right.
It just right?
It's such a great question because, certainly we want to validate our loved one. You know, if they've been catapulted suddenly or even gradually into a major life crisis, then we want to validate the big feelings that come up, you know, in those situations. Your loved one may be full of confusion or despair or anxiety and overwhelm, and you want to validate that whatever they feel, it's okay for them to be feeling. On the other hand, you don't want to impose your own perceptions on them, separate your own emotions from their emotions. Don't expect your perceptions to always match up perfectly. It's that fine line between, you know, supporting and encouraging and not getting overly involved or offering unsolicited opinions or advice. It is tricky.
That's the tightrope you have to walk, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, was my next question. What sort of questions do I need to ask them? Do I just sit there and listen and go, oh, okay, that's terrible and I hope you're okay? Or do I say, tell me how that makes you feel or tell me how that happened? Or is it a horses for courses scenario?
Well, I mean, you know, in psychology we say case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
We love that term, which just really is horses for courses. It depends on the context and the issue that they're struggling with. And if it's something you don't know a lot about, if it's a mental health issue like addiction or depression or something that, you don't know a lot about. Maybe they're experiencing discrimination in the workplace. You can inform yourself. You can do your own reading. And sometimes that is very appropriate because that shows support. You can say, look, I've been reading up on this because I don't know a lot about it, you know, and you can have a discussion about it. You can ask the person what they need from you because their support needs might change over time. Saying, how can I support you? Is, you know, an open-ended question, as is, what is this like for you? Tell me more. All those kind of minimal encourages, as we call them in counselling, just to show the other person that you're listening and you're trying to understand. Yeah.
We've got a text here from Stuart. He said he's supported people, but he's also been supported himself. And he recommends services out there. Are there services out there to assist the people who are doing the supporting?
Well, I mean, there are support groups, say, for parents. There's support groups for people who are bereaved by suicide. There are support groups for people who've been affected directly and indirectly. But there's probably a real lack or a gap in the society of certain types of support groups for supporters. And this is often why they seek out individual support through therapy and come and see someone like me.
Right. Now, let's say the life-changing incident was a death of someone close to them.
Yeah.
Now, what I have, my own experience, having lost a few people close to me, is that quite often, up to the funeral, it is chaos. It's all hands on deck.
Yeah.
And then the noise is so high and you almost never have a moment to yourself.
It's very stressful. Yeah.
It is stressful, but everyone's there trying to do the right thing.
And saying all the right things.
Exactly.
Usually. Yeah.
But literally, the day you wake up after the funeral, it's crickets.
Yes.
That's and that.
Yeah, it can be like that.
It is, for me, that is really, really prominent. Now, is there some advice that you can give people to say, okay, you need to maintain contact, or
if you're the bereaved person, or
if you're supporting, let's say it's my best friend who's lost their loved one.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you're a friend of someone who's recently had a loss through death or some other kind of loss, a breakup, it's similar when people get divorced, you know. People expect that 6 months later you're doing fine and you're not doing fine. And a good friend will say, how's that going for you now? How can I support you now? Or, you know, how is that? I've got my father recently passed away, and so I know what you're talking about, just a couple of months ago. And my good friends say, how's that sitting in you now? How are you doing now? And I think that's such a beautiful thing, just to check in, not to make a big deal of it and expect an hour-long conversation. It might only be a couple of minutes, but just that check-in. So don't be afraid to check in with your friends who've experienced a loss or a stressful life event, particularly if you can ask a gentle, open-ended question. How are you travelling now?
Let's say I am the support person.
Yes.
And let's say I'm looking after, I'm not looking after, that's a bad way of putting it, I feel. Let's say I'm supporting someone who is going through this traumatic life event. And as you said, it could be a mental health issue. It could be the loss of someone. It may be a diagnosis.
Yes.
All of these things.
Or a divorce.
Yeah. They all pretty much manifest themselves physically and mentally in a very, very similar way.
Yeah.
And then the behaviours are going to be similar coming out the back of that.
They can be, yeah.
And then for the support person, depending on how much of an empath you are, you do take on some of those feelings, and you certainly get involved in that, and you do, whether it's via osmosis or whatever the process is, you take some of that home with you. How do you look after yourself in that situation? Because it is important to look after yourself when you are supporting someone.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, it's, again, walking a bit of a tightrope, because these feelings of grief and empathy are universal feelings, and we are not wise to shut them down. Definitely, I've cried a couple of times over the years when my clients have told me a very heartbreaking story. Even as a therapist, I get tears in my eyes. And with friends sharing their pain, I'll feel some of their pain. I think that's beautiful. That's love. But if you're going home and thinking about it hours later, and if it's keeping you up and it's distracting you, and then it may be the case that you're holding yourself way too responsible for that other person's feelings or experiences. And that's an issue to look at, because their story is their story. Your story is your story. And in fact, if you get too involved emotionally and you start feeling guilty, you know, like survivor guilt or some other kind of guilt, it actually blocks compassion. I always say that healthy compassion has a degree of healthy detachment, which is that thing of, this is my story, not your story. Your story is yours, not mine. And I can actually give more compassion if I can stay a little detached in a healthy and caring way.
Dr. Rachel Hannam, in closing, if I do find myself in the position where I am looking after someone, as I said, who is going through one of these events, give me your top, I know it's hard to do, give me your top 3 tips of how I should conduct myself and how I should support that person. What are the I guess the 3 real, I guess, cornerstones of being a good supporting person? Empathy and curiosity. Yep.
So starting a dialogue, never a debate. Don't debate people about their feelings.
Yep.
Validate their feelings. It's okay for them to be feeling whatever they're feeling. Encourage and support them to get appropriate help.
Yeah.
Ask them how you can support them, and communicate hope and trust in their ability to cope and manage. So not abandoning them, but saying, look, you're doing well, give them those words of encouragement and hope for the future.
That's an interesting one, encouraging hope and telling them that perhaps the, all is not lost. There is definitely a future there, and there is... The sun will come up tomorrow.
People grow from, pain and grief. That's right. Post-traumatic growth, we call it. Yes.
Post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, it's a real thing. And so, communicating that hope and your trust in their resilience is something you should also do.
Well, Dr. Rachel, we do have a caller here, actually.
Okay.
Liz from Tingalpa. How are you?
Hi there. Hello, how are you going?
I'm good. Hey, thanks for calling in, because you know what, that actually takes courage to call in when we're talking about something like this. Have you had to support someone through a particularly difficult time?
Yeah, my mother was suicidal a few years ago, and it was actually one of my sons was due to go back home to her house after school, and I actually, for some reason, stopped in first and found her. And obviously she got some treatment for a little while, and then they released them back in once they're sort of on medication and whatnot. But it was always sort of in the back of my mind. I was constantly going over there, constantly calling and checking. And earlier, like you were saying, sometimes it's that unhealthy attachment, and you can get a little bit too obsessed with someone else, even though it's your mother or it could be a close friend. You've still got to remember your own family and your own, and it's very, very hard in that time to sort of not be in there feel like you have to save them or, just that unhealthy attachment. It wasn't until actually my brother was able to sort of take her into his home for a couple of weeks that I actually realised, wow, my job and my family and everything else was sort of taking a real back seat to my focus on my mum. And at the end of the day, we can't control other people. You can support them, but they really ultimately have to help themselves with that support as well.
That's right. You can love them and support them, but you can't hold yourself responsible for their problems.
Thanks so much for calling in, Liz. That was really courageous of you. Thanks so much. Dr. Rachel, what a wonderful chat, and thank you so much for
you.
spending the time and coming in to talk to us about this. Dr. Rachel Hannam, Clinical Director of North Brisbane Psychology. It's been an absolute pleasure.